Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'm very glad to have this timely opportunity to speak to an issue which our caucus has been speaking to in one way or another since I was elected over 4 years ago, and that is the issue of the accessibility and utility, really, of our committee structure. So here in Nova Scotia, we have a unique legislative committee, and that is the Law Amendments Committee. And that committee gives this House the unbelievably important opportunity to hear representations from the public on the bills that are before us. And Madam Speaker, I have to say that I was reflecting today. Someone said to me yesterday, wow, like I didn't know the legislature was going to be like this. I didn't know we were going to hear stories and there were going to be so many tears and so much thoughtfulness. And that is change. That's new, I would say, even since I've been elected. And I think as we have more diversity in this chamber, we have more opportunity to hear people's stories, and those stories reflect different life experiences, and those stories move us in different ways because they're stories that many of us may not have heard or experienced before, as the member from Dartmouth Cole Harbour just mentioned. We have these unique life experiences, but notwithstanding that, I would submit that we still don't have a fraction of the representation in this chamber alone that would allow us to truly understand the impact of the legislation that moves through this House, the People's House, on behalf of the people of Nova Scotia, which the Premier just today said is the goal of the Progressive Conservative government, to be able to properly understand its impact. And so for that reason, the Law Amendments Committee is not just unique, but I would argue of singular importance in our legislative process. And so this brings me to the text of our motion, which is to allow virtual presentations to the Law Amendment Committee. I will frame this by saying that when I was elected, Madam Speaker, there was no capacity, the technological capacity of this House, of this chamber, of our legislative structure was out of date. And I think if you talk to legislative television, they'll probably still tell you they would love a serious infusion of capital that would allow them to continue to update. We know even in our constituency offices, updating technology, updating computers, it's very expensive. But the House staff and legislative TV in particular really underwent a pretty Herculean feat when the pandemic hit. And when we were allowed to convene as committees again, which we were prevented from doing for quite some time, I should say. But when we were allowed to reconvene, they made it possible that we could do that in a safe way. And as with everything else we've learned to do over the last couple of years of COVID almost, that was to meet virtually. We can see each other's faces, we can hear each other's voices, we can experience a presentation from someone in as close to as possible a simulation of them being in the room. And Mr. Speaker, that was a huge leap forward for the accessibility of that committee in two ways. One, it allowed everyone who doesn't live in HRM to actually present to that committee, because as we saw just the other day, but which has been the pattern for at least a decade, I'm sure beyond, there is not proper, well, there is proper, but there's not particularly sufficient notice given usually for the convening of that committee. So in this case, committee, we are given an announcement that a committee is going to meet on a Friday evening, and that committee is going to meet on a Monday night. That's not a lot of time. Sometimes it's even less notice than that. And so the reality of that, Madam Speaker, is that only people in HRM, realistically, only people in HRM with no work conflicts, babysitters, who are able-bodied, I should say, or not without barriers to transportation or mobility, can actually come into this House and present. And so we were able to overcome all those barriers in a fell swoop by allowing people to make virtual presentations. On October 7th, the Premier told reporters he wanted that to continue. And as someone who has spoken out about and sits on many committees in my time in this House, I have to say I was thrilled because it's the right thing to do. We spent a lot of time even getting to the place where we could have cart services, where people could watch video. So previously there was only an audio stream that was available of those committees, or Hansard much, much, much later. And so the first step in that accessibility was those cart services, the video stream, which airs live on YouTube, and this was the next step. And so there are these two streams. There are creating accessibility for people in rural Nova Scotia, which I would suggest is the vast majority of the constituents of the governing party. And there is also creating accessibility for those who are mobility impaired or who otherwise would have challenges in presenting to this House. And to that end, I will say in 2018, I think it was, 2017, just before I was elected, this House passed an incredible piece of accessibility legislation. And that, number one, that bill would not have been passed if it hadn't been for the Law Amendments Committee, for the amazing advocacy that took place in that committee. But what came out of that was the Accessibility Directorate and consultations, which all are aimed at creating an accessible Nova Scotia by 2030. And this is really low-hanging fruit. We need to be leaders in this effort. And so the fact that the Premier would walk back a commitment, not to creating, but to maintaining accessible access to the Law Amendments Committee for everyone in Nova Scotia, for people in rural Nova Scotia, for people with mobility issues, is really strange. I mean, it's the only word I can think of. And again, you know, we are left to wonder, well, why? Why would that happen? And the only thing we can think of is that we want to hear from people, but like not too much, right? So we want the public to have input, but like not that much input, just a little bit of input, particularly if it's input that we know is not going to be favorable to the government. And so the students and teachers and educators of this province have a long history that has been exercised pretty recently of showing up in big numbers when they don't like a piece of legislation. And they have indicated in no uncertain terms that they are not fans of the government's Elections Act amendment that they introduced, their Bill 1. And so what did they do? They started to organize and they wanted to present. But a teacher can't drive here from Pictou County, can't drive here from Shelburne, can't drive here from any number of other places for a Monday night meeting that goes till 11 o'clock at night. They can't do it. And we're going to hear, Madam Speaker, from the governing party that they can still write a letter. And again, I would ask the members of this chamber to think about how many letters they get. And while it is important that we read the correspondence that comes to our office, there is a different level of persuasion and a different level of access that is allowed when you can be in dialogue with a person, when a person can present to you in person, when they can ask a question, and when you can respond to that question. So, Madam Speaker, I mean, it feels a little bit like Groundhog Day. So we had this conversation a lot when we were locked out of this legislature for almost a year, and we heard from a different government, you know, we can't do it, it's not going to work, when everyone we knew was working from home with Zoom, when all of our children were going to school virtually. This is the same conversation again. My 8-year-old knows how to have a Google Meet. Like anybody in this province at this point knows how to do this, knows how to video conference. We have the capacity, we have the will, we have the ability, and the only thing stopping us from making this important crown jewel of a committee accessible to all Nova Scotians, regardless of disability, regardless of the place that they live, is the Premier deciding he doesn't want it to be accessible. So I invite the Premier to change that decision. He has said they're looking at it, so I hope that he continues to look at it. And I really hope, you know, for all of the people who aren't able to voice their concerns on a piece of legislation, that they change this decision. Thank you, Madam Speaker.